He thought he could quietly erase her reputation in a single courtroom session, but he had no idea he had just exposed the one person who could dismantle everything he built. The courtroom doors opened with a low creak, and Emma Lawson stepped inside, her soft-soled shoes barely making a sound against the polished marble floor, yet every head turned as if she had thundered in, because in that moment, silence carried more weight than noise. She wore a simple navy sweater and carried a worn leather folder close to her chest, her posture calm, but her fingers just tight enough to reveal the pressure beneath the surface. And across the room, elevated behind a bench carved from dark oak, Judge Franklin Pierce adjusted his cuffs with slow precision, his expression unreadable, but his eyes sharp, already fixed on her as though she were nothing more than a case file to be processed and dismissed. He had planned this moment carefully. Every document prepared, every angle considered, every outcome controlled. And yet there was something about the way Emma stood there, not shrinking, not rushing, simply present, that stirred a flicker of irritation he couldn't quite explain. The clerk called the session to order, the echo of her voice bouncing off the high ceilings, and as Emma stepped forward, a quiet murmur rippled through the gallery. Spectators leaning toward one another, whispering assumptions formed in seconds, their eyes scanning her modest appearance, already deciding who she was and, more importantly, who she wasn't. Judge Pierce leaned forward slightly, his voice smooth, practiced, carrying authority without needing volume. "Miss Lawson, you've been summoned here today under serious allegations," he said, each word measured, each pause intentional, as if the weight of his position alone should be enough to bend the truth in his favor. Emma lifted her gaze to meet his, her eyes steady, unflinching, and for a brief second, something shifted in the room, subtle, but undeniable, like the air itself tightening. She nodded once, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, and that small distinction went unnoticed by most, but not by him. He had seen hundreds of defendants stand where she stood, had watched confidence crumble under pressure, had watched voices falter, had watched people shrink into themselves the moment they realized the system was not designed to protect them. And he expected no different now, but Emma did not look away, did not fidget, did not plead. She simply waited, and that patience unsettled him more than defiance ever could. Outside the tall windows, the late morning light filtered through, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor, stretching toward her feet like silent witnesses, and somewhere in the back row, a man cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the otherwise controlled stillness. Judge Pierce continued, outlining the charges with a tone that suggested inevitability, as if the conclusion had already been written before she ever stepped through the door, and with each sentence, the room leaned further into his narrative, absorbing it, accepting it, because authority, when spoken with enough confidence, often replaces truth. Emma listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, but beneath that calm exterior, her mind moved with quiet precision, connecting details, recalling facts, assembling something far more powerful than emotion. And as the judge spoke, convinced he was tightening the net around her, he failed to notice the one thing that would soon unravel everything. She wasn't reacting like someone trapped, she was listening like someone preparing. The gavel rested inches from his hand, a symbol of control, of finality, of decisions that could not be easily undone, and he tapped it lightly, not to silence the room, but to remind everyone who held the power there. "Do you understand the seriousness of these accusations?" he asked, his voice lowering just enough to draw her in, to force her into his frame, into his narrative. Emma inhaled slowly, the movement almost imperceptible, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, clear, and steady, carrying across the room without strain. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand exactly what's being presented," she said, and there was something in the way she emphasized the word presented that lingered in the air just a fraction longer than expected, like a note slightly out of tune, subtle enough to ignore, but impossible to forget. Judge Pierce paused, just for a heartbeat, then nodded, dismissing the feeling as nothing more than confidence misplaced, because in his world, outcomes were predictable, power was absolute, and people like her did not change the course of anything. But as the room settled back into its uneasy quiet, one truth remained. invisible to everyone except the one person standing at the center of it all. This wasn't the beginning of her downfall. It was the moment his control quietly began to slip, and no one, not even the man who believed he controlled everything, had realized it yet. The weight of the judge's words settled across the courtroom like a carefully placed verdict, not yet spoken but already assumed. And as the clerk shuffled papers and adjusted the microphone, the quiet tension grew thicker, almost visible in the still air. Emma Lawson remained standing at the center, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table before her, her gaze steady but observant, taking in every movement, every glance, every subtle shift in posture from the people around her. Because while most in that room saw only a simple woman facing serious allegations, Emma saw something else entirely. She saw patterns, inconsistencies, and the faint outlines of a narrative that did not quite hold together. Judge Franklin Pierce leaned back slightly in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin, watching her with a controlled patience that bordered on satisfaction, as if he had already anticipated every possible response she could give and found them all insufficient. And when he gestured for the clerk to proceed, his confidence radiated through the room like a signal no one questioned. The clerk began reading from the file, her voice clear and formal, outlining a sequence of events that painted Emma as negligent, uncooperative, and in violation of legal obligations, each detail presented with the precision of official documentation, each statement reinforcing the image being constructed. And as the narrative unfolded, a few spectators exchanged knowing glances, their earlier whispers now replaced with quiet certainty, because once a story is told with authority, doubt rarely survives long enough to challenge it. Emma listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, but her mind moved quickly beneath the surface, tracing the timeline being described, matching it against her own memory, identifying where the sequence faltered, where dates overlapped in ways they should not, where language was used not to clarify but to obscure, and most importantly, where intent had been quietly inserted into facts that should have remained neutral. Judge Pierce allowed the reading to continue just long enough for the impression to settle before raising his hand slightly, bringing the clerk to a stop, and when he spoke again, his tone carried a subtle edge, as if inviting her to respond while already anticipating her failure to do so effectively. Miss Lawson, this court has been presented with clear documentation supporting these claims. Would you care to explain your position before we proceed further? He said, his voice calm but firm, the kind of tone that suggested fairness while quietly reinforcing control. A faint rustle moved through the gallery as heads turned toward Emma, the unspoken expectation hanging heavily in the air. This was the moment where most would stumble, where words would tangle under pressure, where uncertainty would reveal itself. But Emma did not rush. She did not fill the silence immediately. Instead, she allowed it to exist, to stretch just long enough for the room to become aware of it. And in that pause, something shifted, subtle but undeniable. She lifted her folder and opened it slowly, the soft sound of paper moving against paper echoing more loudly than it should have in the quiet space. And as she glanced down briefly, her eyes moved with purpose, not searching, but confirming. And when she looked back up, her expression carried a quiet clarity that had not been there before. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady, measured, and unexpectedly composed. "I would like to understand how the timeline presented accounts for the documented correspondence submitted prior to these alleged violations," she said, her words precise, carefully chosen, and delivered without hesitation. The effect was immediate, not dramatic, but noticeable, a slight pause from the clerk, a subtle tightening in the posture of one of the attorneys seated to the side, and for the briefest moment, a flicker of something unreadable crossed Judge Pierce's face before it was quickly replaced by his usual composure. He adjusted his position slightly, his fingers tapping once against the bench before becoming still again, and when he responded, his voice remained controlled, but there was now a hint of something beneath it, something sharper, something more deliberate. "The court will address relevant details in due course, Miss Lawson. For now, I suggest you focus on responding to the charges as presented," he said, attempting to redirect, to maintain the structure he had carefully built. But Emma did not retreat. She nodded once, acknowledging his words without conceding to them, and in that moment, The dynamic in the room began to shift in a way that few fully understood. Because what had seemed like a straightforward proceeding was no longer moving along its expected path. And, as the silence returned, heavier now, more attentive, it became clear that this was no longer just a matter of accusation and defense. It was becoming something else entirely, something that required more than authority to control, and somewhere beneath the surface of that realization, the first quiet crack had begun to form. For a moment, the courtroom held its breath, as if even the walls themselves were waiting to see who would move next, and Emma Lawson did not rush to fill that silence. She allowed it to stretch, to settle, to force attention where it had not been before, and in doing so, she shifted the balance in a way so subtle that most did not recognize it until it had already begun. Judge Franklin Pierce studied her now with a sharper focus, no longer dismissing her as easily as he had moments ago. Because there was something different in the way she spoke, not defensive, not emotional, but precise, controlled, and deliberate, like someone who understood not just the words being used, but the structure behind them. He straightened slightly, adjusting the papers before him, reasserting his authority through movement alone, and with a small motion of his hand, he signaled for the proceedings to continue, determined to guide the narrative back into familiar territory. "Miss Lawson," he said, his tone firmer now, less accommodating. "This court will not be diverted by selective interpretations. You are here to respond to the allegations, not to question procedural flow." And his words carried the weight of expectation, the kind that usually silenced further resistance. But Emma did not lower her gaze, did not step back. Instead, she nodded once, acknowledging his statement with calm composure. And then she spoke again, her voice steady and measured. "Your Honor, I fully intend to respond, but clarity is essential for accuracy, and accuracy is essential for justice," she said. And the choice of that final word lingered in the air just long enough to make its presence felt. A faint murmur moved through the gallery, quickly suppressed, but not before it signaled that attention had shifted, even slightly, away from the assumed outcome and toward the unfolding exchange. Emma lowered her eyes briefly to the documents in her folder, her fingers moving with quiet certainty as she turned a page, and when she looked up again, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. Only a calm focus that contrasted sharply with the tension building around her. The correspondence referenced in the timeline was submitted on March 15th at 9:32 in the morning, confirmed by receipt and acknowledgement, yet the alleged failure to comply is recorded as occurring prior to that submission, she said, her tone neutral, almost conversational, but each word landed with precision, and for the first time, the narrative presented earlier did not flow as seamlessly as it had before. The clerk glanced down at her own documents, her expression tightening ever so slightly, while one of the attorneys seated near the front shifted in his chair, his pen pausing mid-note, and though no one spoke, the change in energy was unmistakable. Judge Pierce's jaw tightened for a fraction of a second before he masked it, his fingers pressing lightly against the surface of the bench, and when he responded, his voice remained controlled, but the ease that had defined it earlier was no longer quite as smooth. "Documentation can be interpreted in multiple ways, Miss Lawson. The court will determine relevance," he said, attempting to reframe, to reassert control over the direction of the discussion. But Emma did not challenge him directly. She did not raise her voice or argue. Instead, she simply inclined her head slightly and continued, "Of course, Your Honor, which is why I believe it is important to ensure that all elements are presented in their correct sequence," she said. And again, there was that quiet precision, that careful layering of logic that did not confront authority, but instead moved around it, reshaping the ground beneath it. The room grew quieter, if that was even possible, the kind of silence that was no longer passive, but attentive, aware that something was shifting, even if it could not yet be fully named. Outside, a faint breeze moved the branches visible through the tall windows, casting shifting patterns of light across the polished floor, but inside, nothing moved, not noticeably, not openly, and yet everything had begun to change. Judge Pierce leaned forward again, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her, no longer seeing a simple woman standing before him, but something more complex, something less predictable. And though he did not yet understand the full extent of it, He recognized the first signs of resistance, not loud or aggressive, but structured, deliberate, and difficult to dismiss. And as Emma closed her folder gently, her hands returning to rest calmly before her, the message was clear, even without being spoken aloud. She was not reacting to the case being presented, she was beginning to take it apart, piece by piece. And in that quiet, controlled dismantling, the foundation that had seemed so solid only moments before was beginning, almost imperceptibly, to shift beneath them all. The silence that followed was no longer neutral. It carried weight, expectation, and a quiet awareness that something was no longer unfolding the way it had been intended. And Judge Franklin Pierce felt it, not as an obvious disruption, but as a subtle resistance pressing against the structure he had so carefully arranged. He shifted slightly in his seat, his hand brushing the edge of the gavel as though to remind both himself and the room where authority still resided. And when he spoke again, his tone was firmer, more deliberate. "Miss Lawson, this court operates on established procedure, not on reinterpretations offered in hindsight," he said, his voice carrying just enough edge to reassert control. Yet beneath that control was a growing urgency to move the proceedings forward before the balance shifted any further. Emma Lawson did not react to the change in tone. She did not mirror it, did not challenge it. Instead, she remained composed, her posture unchanged, her eyes steady. And that stillness became its own form of presence, one that did not compete with authority, but quietly existed alongside it. She placed one hand lightly on her folder, her fingers resting against the worn leather, as if grounding herself not in the room, but in something far more certain. And when she spoke again, her voice remained calm, measured, and clear. "Your Honor, I am not offering reinterpretation. I am referencing sequence, and sequence determines context," she said, her words simple, but structured with an underlying precision that made them difficult to dismiss without examination. A faint shift moved through the courtroom, not loud, not disruptive, but perceptible, as if attention itself had begun to lean in more closely, no longer satisfied with surface explanations. The clerk glanced again at the documents before her, this time more carefully, her eyes moving back and forth across the page as though searching for something she had not been instructed to find, while one of the attorneys quietly adjusted his glasses, his earlier confidence replaced by a more cautious observation. Judge Pierce noticed these changes, small as they were, and though his expression remained controlled, his focus sharpened, narrowing slightly as he regarded Emma, no longer seeing her as a passive participant, but as someone who was beginning to influence the direction of the room itself. "Then proceed carefully, Miss Lawson," he said, his voice lower now, measured not just for authority, but for control. "Because this court will not entertain irrelevant deviations." And though the words were framed as a warning, they carried something else beneath them, an acknowledgement, however slight, that the exchange was no longer entirely predictable. Emma inclined her head once, accepting the condition without resistance, and then she moved with quiet intention, opening her folder once more, her fingers selecting a document with deliberate care, and as she placed it on the table before her, she did not rush to present it. She allowed the moment to settle, to create space for attention to gather, and in that space, the faint sound of paper against wood seemed louder than it should have been. "The acknowledgement timestamp from the court office confirms receipt of my submission at 9:32 in the morning," she said, her voice even, her delivery precise. "However, the record presented earlier indicates non-compliance at 9:15, and she paused, not for effect, but because the numbers themselves required no embellishment. The room did not react immediately, but the absence of reaction was itself telling, a pause that extended just long enough for the inconsistency to take shape in the minds of those listening. The clerk's pen hovered above the page without moving, and somewhere in the gallery, a quiet shift of posture signaled that attention had sharpened further. Judge Pierce's fingers pressed together lightly, his gaze fixed on the document before Emma, and for a brief moment, his silence was not one of control, but of calculation. When he spoke again, his voice remained composed, but the ease that had once defined it had been replaced by something more deliberate, more cautious. "Clerical discrepancies can occur, Miss Lawson. They do not invalidate the broader context of the case," he said, attempting to contain the impact, to reframe the detail as insignificant within the larger narrative. But Emma did not contest the statement directly. She did not argue its validity. Instead, she nodded slightly, acknowledging the possibility without conceding its implication, and then she added, "Of course, Your Honor, but when sequence establishes compliance, the definition of noncompliance requires reconsideration, and with that, the foundation beneath the proceedings shifted again, not dramatically, not visibly, but undeniably. The room fell into a deeper silence, one no longer shaped by assumption, but by attention, and as Judge Pierce leaned back slightly, his gaze lingering on Emma with a focus that no longer dismissed her, it became clear that this was no longer a controlled presentation of facts. It was becoming an examination, and for the first time, the direction of that examination was no longer entirely in his hands. The numbers did not raise their voices. They did not argue. They simply existed, and in their quiet precision, they carried a weight that no assertion could easily override. And as that realization settled into the room, the atmosphere shifted once more, not dramatically, but with a subtle gravity that pulled attention inward. Judge Franklin Pierce remained still for a moment longer than expected, his gaze fixed on the document Emma Lawson had placed before him, and though his posture remained composed, there was a tightening at the corners of his expression that had not been there before, a small but undeniable sign that something had moved beyond his immediate control. He reached for the document with measured deliberation, lifting it just enough to examine the timestamp himself, as if confirming what he had already heard, and in that brief action, the room seemed to lean forward collectively, not in sound, but in focus. Emma did not speak. She did not press the point. She simply allowed the evidence to exist in the space between them, knowing that in moments like this, silence could carry more force than argument. The clerk adjusted her position slightly, her earlier certainty replaced by a careful attention, her eyes moving between the judge and the document as though awaiting direction that had not yet been given. Judge Pierce lowered the paper slowly, placing it back on the bench with controlled precision. And when he spoke, his voice remained steady, but the cadence had changed, each word now measured not just for authority, but for stability. "As I stated, clerical inconsistencies do not negate the totality of the case," he said, though this time the statement did not land with the same unquestioned acceptance it might have moments earlier. A quiet pause followed, longer than any before it, and in that pause, something fundamental began to shift, not in the facts themselves, but in how they were being received. Emma inclined her head slightly, her expression calm, almost neutral, yet there was a clarity in her eyes that had sharpened, as if each piece of the structure being presented was becoming easier to see through. She spoke again, not with urgency, not with confrontation, but with a steady logic that continued to unfold. "Your Honor, I understand the court's position. However, when the sequence of documented events contradicts the basis of the allegation, the interpretation of intent must be reconsidered," she said, and her words did not challenge authority directly. They simply redirected attention back to the foundation beneath it. A faint murmur moved through the gallery before being quickly silenced, but the energy had changed, no longer passive, no longer certain, now attentive, questioning in a way that had not been present before. One of the attorneys shifted forward in his seat, his pen tapping lightly against his notebook before becoming still, his focus now entirely on the exchange unfolding before him. Judge Pierce noticed this, of course he did, and for the first time, the control he had relied upon began to feel less absolute, not gone, but no longer unquestioned. He leaned forward again, his hands resting on the bench, his gaze fixed on Emma with a renewed intensity, as if recalibrating his approach in real time. "Miss Lawson, the court will determine the relevance of all presented materials," he said, but the statement, though firm, carried a different weight now, less final, more conditional. Emma nodded once more, accepting the statement without resistance, and then, with quiet precision, she turned another page in her folder, her movements unhurried, deliberate, and when she spoke again, her tone remained composed, but there was now an unmistakable momentum beneath it. "Then I would respectfully ask the court to consider the communication logs submitted alongside the initial filing," which confirms acknowledgement not only of receipt, but of compliance, she said, and as the words settled into the room, the implication followed closely behind them, not forced, not exaggerated, simply present. The clerk's hand moved almost instinctively toward her own documents, flipping through pages with a newfound urgency, her earlier rhythm replaced by a careful search, and the faint sound of paper shifting filled the silence in a way that drew attention rather than broke it. Judge Pierce's eyes followed the movement briefly before returning to Emma, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. Not a confrontation, not yet, but an awareness, a recognition that the dynamic had changed in a way that could not easily be reversed. The courtroom remained quiet, but it was no longer the quiet of assumption. It was the quiet of observation, of recalculation, and as Emma stood there, her posture steady, her presence composed, it became clear that what had begun as a controlled proceeding was now unfolding into something far more complex, something that could no longer be guided by authority alone, and in that realization, the first true signs of imbalance had begun to emerge. The faint sound of pages turning from the clerk's desk seemed louder now, not because it had changed, but because the room had grown so attentive that even the smallest movement carried significance, and Emma Lawson remained exactly where she stood, her posture unchanged, her hands resting lightly against the table as though she had all the time in the world, while across from her, Judge Franklin Pierce no longer moved with the same effortless confidence that had defined the beginning of the session. His eyes followed the clerk's actions closely, his expression controlled, but no longer distant. And when the clerk finally stopped flipping through the documents, her hesitation spoke before she did, a brief pause that stretched just long enough to be noticed by everyone present. "Your Honor," she began carefully, her voice quieter than before. "There is an entry here confirming acknowledgement of receipt at 9:32, along with a note indicating compliance verification." And the words, though simple, landed with a clarity that could not be easily dismissed. The room did not react immediately, but the silence that followed was no longer passive. It was charged, focused, and unmistakably aware that something had shifted beyond expectation. Judge Pierce's fingers pressed together once more, his gaze fixed on the document now in the clerk's hand, and for a brief moment, he did not speak. A pause that would have gone unnoticed earlier, but now carried weight. When he finally responded, his voice remained composed, but there was a subtle tightening. Beneath it, "Clerical notes are not determinations of legal standing," he said, though the statement felt less definitive than it had moments ago, as though it were being placed carefully rather than asserted confidently. Emma inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement without resistance, and then, with the same calm precision that had guided her from the beginning, she took a single step forward, not enough to challenge the space, but enough to be fully present within it. And when she spoke again, her voice carried a quiet authority that did not seek to dominate, but to clarify. "Understood, Your Honor. However, when the record reflects both receipt and compliance prior to the alleged violation, the basis for that violation requires examination," she said, and her words did not rise in volume, yet they seemed to reach every corner of the room. A faint shift moved through the gallery, not loud, but perceptible, as if the collective understanding had begun to realign, and one of the attorneys seated near the front leaned forward slightly, his earlier posture replaced by a focused attention that mirrored the room itself. Judge Pierce watched Emma closely now, no longer as a participant in a controlled proceeding, but as someone actively shaping it, and though his expression remained composed, there was a sharpness in his gaze that revealed the recalculations happening behind it. He reached again for the document, reviewing it more carefully this time, his eyes scanning the details with a precision that had not been necessary before, and as he did, the courtroom remained completely still, the kind of stillness that felt almost deliberate, as though no one wanted to disrupt the moment unfolding before them. Emma did not speak. She did not press further. She simply allowed the evidence to exist, knowing that each second of silence now carried more weight than any argument she could add. And in that silence, the structure that had once seemed so certain continued to shift, not collapsing, not yet, but no longer stable. Judge Pierce placed the document back down slowly, his movements controlled, measured, And when he looked up again, his voice, though steady, carried a different tone, less absolute, more deliberate. "The court will review the sequence in detail," he said, and while the words themselves suggested control, the shift in phrasing revealed something else, an acknowledgement that the matter was no longer as straightforward as it had been presented. Emma nodded once, her expression calm, but her eyes steady, and in that quiet exchange, something became clear to everyone present, even if they could not fully articulate it. This was no longer a case moving toward a predetermined outcome. It was becoming an examination where each detail mattered, where each sequence held weight, and where authority alone could no longer define the truth. The room remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of expectation. It was the silence of realization, and as the moment settled, the balance that had once leaned so heavily in one direction now stood uncertain, shifting, and for the first time since the proceedings began, the outcome was no longer something that could be assumed. It was something that would have to be proven. The air in the courtroom had changed in a way that no one could ignore anymore, not because of any loud declaration, but because certainty itself had begun to dissolve. And as Judge Franklin Pierce sat there, reviewing the documents with a level of attention he had not needed before, the illusion of control he once held so effortlessly was no longer absolute. Emma Lawson stood quietly, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, and in that stillness, she seemed less like someone defending herself and more like someone guiding the direction of the room without ever raising her voice. The clerk remained focused on the records, her earlier rhythm replaced by a careful, almost cautious examination, and the faint scratch of her pen as she made a note broke the silence just enough to remind everyone that this moment was being recorded, documented, preserved. Judge Pierce finally lifted his gaze, his expression composed, but now marked by a subtle tension that had not been there at the beginning. And when he spoke, his tone was controlled, but no longer dismissive. "Miss Lawson, the court acknowledges the discrepancy in sequence. However, discrepancies alone do not establish the absence of violation," he said, attempting to reframe the situation, to regain a structure that had begun to slip. Emma nodded slightly, accepting the statement without resistance, and then, with the same calm precision that had defined every word she had spoken so far, she responded, "That is correct, Your Honor, which is why I would like to clarify not just the sequence, but the authorization associated with that sequence," she said, and her choice of the word authorization landed with a quiet significance that immediately drew attention. A faint shift moved through the room, not audible, but perceptible, as if a new layer of the discussion had just been introduced, one that had not yet been considered. Judge Pierce's eyes narrowed slightly, his focus sharpening once more, and though he did not interrupt, his posture indicated that he was now listening more carefully than before, aware that each statement carried potential implications beyond what was immediately visible. Emma reached into her folder again, her movements unhurried, deliberate, and when she withdrew a second document, she held it lightly, not as evidence to be forced upon the room, but as something that would speak for itself when the time was right. "The acknowledgement entry does not only confirm receipt," she continued, her voice steady. "It includes a verification code assigned by the court system, indicating that the submission was processed and accepted under standard compliance protocols." And as she spoke, the structure of the narrative shifted once more, not through confrontation, but through clarity. The clerk leaned forward slightly, her attention now fully engaged, and she flipped through her records again, this time with a purpose that had not been present earlier, her eyes scanning quickly before stopping. And though she did not speak immediately, the change in her expression was enough to signal that she had found something. Judge Pierce followed this movement closely, his gaze moving between the clerk and Emma, and for a brief moment, the silence that settled over the room carried a different kind of weight, not tension, but realization beginning to take shape. Emma did not rush to fill that silence. She allowed it to exist, knowing that each second now worked in her favor, and when the clerk finally spoke, her voice was careful, measured. "Your Honor, the verification code is present in the system log, and it corresponds to a completed compliance entry," she said, and with that statement, the structure that had once seemed so firm shifted again, this time more noticeably. A quiet murmur rippled through the gallery before quickly fading, but it was enough to mark the moment, enough to signal that what had once been assumed was now being questioned openly. Judge Pierce remained still, his expression controlled, but the pause that followed was longer than any before it. And when he finally spoke, his voice, though steady, carried a weight that suggested something had changed. "The court will take this into consideration," he said, and though the words were simple, they marked a turning point, a subtle but undeniable acknowledgement that the narrative was no longer entirely his to define. Emma inclined her head once more, her expression calm, her presence unwavering. And in that moment, it became clear to everyone in the room, even if they did not fully understand how it had happened, that the balance had shifted, not dramatically, not with confrontation, but through a series of precise, deliberate steps that had quietly dismantled the certainty that once filled the space. And as the silence returned once again, it was no longer the silence of control, but the silence of a room beginning to understand that the outcome was no longer predetermined. It was no longer just a discrepancy. It was a pattern, and as that realization settled into the courtroom, the silence that followed carried a weight that no one could ignore, not even Judge Franklin Pierce, who now sat with a stillness that was no longer effortless, but deliberate, controlled, and increasingly cautious. Emma Lawson remained where she stood, her presence unchanged, her posture steady. But there was a quiet shift in her eyes now, not confidence alone, but clarity, the kind that comes when each piece begins to align exactly as expected. She did not rush, she did not press. Instead, she allowed the moment to breathe, to expand, to force recognition where it had once been dismissed. And when she finally spoke again, her voice was calm, measured, and unmistakably precise. "Your Honor, if I may, I would like to direct attention to the system log associated with that verification code," she said. And her words did not demand authority, they guided it. The clerk responded. Almost immediately this time, her earlier hesitation replaced by focused intent, her fingers moving across the keyboard at her station, pulling up the digital record that had until now remained unexamined in full context. The faint glow of the screen reflected in her eyes as she scanned the data, her expression tightening slightly as she read, and though she did not speak right away, the change in her posture was enough to signal that something significant had surfaced. Judge Pierce leaned forward, his gaze fixed not on Emma now, but on the clerk, and for the first time, his attention followed rather than led, a subtle shift that did not go unnoticed. "Clerk, report the entry," he said, his voice steady, but lacking the earlier certainty that had once defined it. The clerk nodded, her voice careful, precise. "The system log indicates that the submission was not only received and verified, but also internally flagged as complete by the reviewing office at 9:34 in the morning," she said, and the words, though delivered plainly, carried a weight that settled deeply into the room. A pause followed, longer than any before, and this time, it was not filled with expectation, but with realization. Emma did not move, did not react outwardly, but there was a quiet finality in the way she stood, as though the structure she had been building piece by piece had now reached its intended form. Judge Pierce's hand hovered briefly over the document before him, then withdrew, and for a moment he said nothing, a silence that would have been unthinkable at the start of the proceedings, but now felt inevitable. When he finally spoke, his voice was controlled, but there was a shift beneath it, something less absolute, more measured. "Miss Lawson, the court acknowledges the existence of this entry," he said, and though the statement was simple, its implication was not. Emma inclined her head slightly, her expression calm, and then, with the same deliberate clarity that had guided every step so far, she added, "Then the basis for non-compliance no longer aligns with the documented record." And her words did not challenge, they concluded. The room went completely silent, not a shifting silence, not a restless one, but a still, complete absence of sound, the kind that follows when something undeniable has just been placed in the center of the room. One of the attorneys lowered his pen slowly, his earlier movements stilled, while a spectator in the back row leaned forward slightly, as if trying to understand how the direction had changed so completely without any raised voices or visible confrontation. Judge Pierce remained still, his gaze fixed forward, and though his expression was composed, there was no longer any trace of the earlier certainty that had guided him. Only a careful, deliberate stillness that suggested calculation had given way to recognition. He reached for the gavel, not striking it, but resting his hand lightly against it. And in that small, controlled motion, the weight of the moment became clear, because for the first time since the proceedings began, authority was no longer directing the outcome. It was responding to it. Emma stood quietly, her presence unchanged, her voice no longer needed, because the structure she had built now stood on its own, supported not by argument, but by fact. And as the silence held, unbroken and complete, the realization settled across the room with a quiet certainty. This was no longer a case being argued. It was a truth being revealed, and nothing in that room could return to what it had been before. The silence did not break immediately. It lingered, stretched, and settled into every corner of the courtroom, as if even time itself had paused to acknowledge what had just unfolded. And in that stillness, Judge Franklin Pierce sat motionless, his hand resting lightly against the gavel, no longer a symbol of control, but a reminder of the responsibility it carried. His eyes remained fixed forward, not on Emma Lawson, not on the clerk, but somewhere in between, as though recalibrating a reality that no longer aligned with the narrative he had constructed. And when he finally moved, it was slow, deliberate, each motion measured with a precision that spoke not of authority, but of restraint. The court recognizes that the evidence presented establishes prior compliance, he said, his voice steady, but stripped of the earlier certainty that had once defined it. And though the words were formal, their meaning carried far beyond the sentence itself. A quiet shift moved through the gallery. Not a murmur, not a reaction, but a release, as if something unspoken had finally been acknowledged. Emma Lawson stood exactly as she had from the beginning, her posture calm, her expression composed, but there was a quiet finality in her presence now, not triumph, not relief, but resolution, the kind that does not need to be expressed because it has already been understood. Judge Pierce continued, his tone measured. Accordingly, the basis for the alleged violation cannot be sustained under the current record, and with that, the structure that had once been presented as fixed and unquestionable dissolved entirely, not through confrontation, not through force, but through clarity. The clerk made a note, her pen moving steadily across the page, documenting the moment as it became part of the official record, and the faint sound of ink against paper echoed softly, grounding the shift in something permanent. No one spoke, no one interrupted, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to reinterpret, only the quiet recognition of what had been revealed. Judge Pierce lowered his gaze briefly, reviewing the documents one final time before setting them aside, and when he looked up again, there was a subtle change in his expression, not defeat, but acknowledgement, the kind that comes when authority encounters something it cannot override. "This matter is dismissed," he said, and the words, though simple, carried a weight that settled deeply into the room. The gavel came down once, not sharply, not forcefully, but with a controlled finality that marked the end of something far greater than a single proceeding. Emma did not move immediately. She allowed the moment to complete itself, to settle fully before she reached for her folder and closed it with quiet care, her movements unhurried, deliberate, as though nothing in the room could rush her now. She inclined her head slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement of the process, and then she turned, her steps soft against the marble floor as she walked toward the doors, her presence leaving the space as quietly as it had entered, behind her. The courtroom remained still for a moment longer, as if no one was quite ready to move, to speak, to break the realization that had settled among them. One by one, the spectators began to shift, to gather their belongings, but their movements were slower now, more thoughtful, as though each carried away more than they had brought with them. Judge Pierce remained seated, his gaze lowered once more, the weight of the moment lingering in the space around him, and though nothing more was said, the silence that followed spoke clearly enough. Outside, the daylight continued as it always had, unchanged, indifferent, but inside that courtroom, something had shifted in a way that would not easily be forgotten, because on that day, without raising her voice, without demanding attention, Emma Lawson had done something far more powerful. She had allowed the truth to stand on its own, and in doing so, she had reminded everyone in that room that authority may shape a narrative, but only truth can sustain it. And in the quiet that followed, the world, for just a moment, remembered what justice actually looks like.